Hi Year 12. Today I'm going to take you through how to design a fair experiment. So this is building on your ideas video from last week. So hopefully you've started to come up with some good ideas for what you'd like to investigate for your NEA. Now this video goes hand in hand with that. Really, you can't really finalize your idea until you're sure that you can actually carry out your idea in an authentic, reliable way that will give you good data. So it's like a chicken and egg situation. When you've finished watching this video, you might want to go back and revisit your ideas and have a think about how you can do them in a good, reliable way. So we're all about looking for ways to collect reliable evidence which enables you to make valid conclusions about representative samples. And what that means is that your evidence is meaningful in some way. So your conclusions are, so that whatever you find out can be applied to a wider sample or a wider cohort of people, and you're actually finding out something meaningful about how language is used. That doesn't mean you have to find out something that would affect everybody in the country, but a wider social group. Okay, I really encourage you to make notes on this video, A, so you don't have to watch it again, but B, because there's a lot of new terminology here and a lot of new ways of thinking, really, especially if you've not taken science A levels or geography. There's a bit of an overlap. Psychology and sociology, you have to just carry out experiments in a similar way. But if you're not used to thinking in terms of, well, what's a fair methodology, then this is going to be quite new to you. So definitely make notes, because you're going to need to come back to them. And a lot of the terminology that I use in this video is going to have to be in your methodology when you write up your investigation. So it just makes sense to get them in your head now. I will go through how to write your methodology with you in a different video. So this is really just laying the foundations. Okay, let's get started then. So your key terminology, I'm just going to go through this first. There's more, but these are like the basics of what you need to be using when you're writing up your experiment. So firstly, anyone who takes part in your study and is aware of it, you're going to call a participant. Okay, so if you do end up doing interviews or somehow getting people together in some way, or getting them, if they know they're involved in your research investigation, then you can call them a participant. The investigator or researcher is you, so that's how you can refer to yourself. Give yourself a nice posh title. The data is anything you collect as part of your experiment, and it doesn't have to be fresh data like we talked about. You can use data that's already exists in the world, such as TV shows, transcripts, YouTube videos, etc. Your sample is the section of data that you'll select. Now that could also be the people that you select to participate. So for example, if you select just the first minute of an Obama speech, then that's your sample. If you choose to focus on your mum and dad, then they're your sample. Your source is wherever your data comes from. So whether you've gone out and found it yourself, just something that already exists, or whether you've created it, it's just however you've sourced it, where you've got it from. Your methodology is just the design of your data collection. Now, a whole section of your investigation will be based on methodology, and you'll get marks for AO2, which is, as well as getting marks for bringing in theorists, you get marks for basically being able to design a fair, decent experiment. So I think this is kind of the biggest thing that's new, this whole section, really. But I think it's really interesting, and I think it's really useful for university, where you will be expected to do your own study, and your methodology at uni will be much bigger, and you'll have to kind of justify all the steps you took and how you made it fair. Constraints, you have a lot. You are not a scientist in a lab. You're not a psychologist with loads of money at your disposal. You're just one person living in Liverpool and in lockdown as well. So you've got plenty of constraints. So it's things that have stopped you from making the experiment more representative. So obviously, if you were, working for Oxford, you could interview thousands of participants for a study. You're not going to be able to do that. So for example, you have limited time, you have lockdown, definitely include that because it has been a limitation. Obviously, if it's something that your data wouldn't be affected by it, don't include it. The scope of your study is a nice phrase. So really what we mean there is, examiners, you've only given us 2,000 words, so we can't be analysing 50,000 samples. But rather than complain about the word count, which is never a good idea, you can just refer to the scope of the study. If you had a wider scope study, then maybe you could have interviewed or used data from a wider sample. Right, your variables are really, really important. They are the different factors that can influence a person's language in your sample or data. Now, you need to control your variables. We talked about this with Mr. Bowes last week. So if there's just so many things, aren't there? You've learned about this with Miss Carney. There's so many things that influence a person's language. If you're just investigating one of those, then you need to try and keep the rest of the variables the same amongst your participants. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to draw any valid conclusions. So your limitations of your study then, as well as being your constraints are limitations. You're limited in the amount of people you can include, for example, but also variables that you haven't been able to control, that if you had been able to control, it would have been more reliable data. Don't worry about, it's very difficult to remove all the variables that you can't control. All the examiner is looking for is for you to identify them. And as long as you're aware of them and you can evaluate how they've affected your results, you'll actually get some good marks out of doing that. Right, so these are the things that you need to limit if you want to do a little subheading. Sorry, that's a very overwhelming slide. So just a bit more on variables first of all. You need to be able to control them, as I've just said, so that any conclusions you make, you can say it's definitely because of this feature, this language, sorry, can't talk. Definitely because of whatever you're investigating, that this language is different. Now there's two types of variables, and you do need to be referring to these in your investigation. So if you make sure you jot these down. An independent variable is the thing that you are actually controlling, so the thing you're actually investigating. So you might have males and females because you're interested there's a difference. You might be looking at different ethnicity of terrorists, and that they are your independent variables that you're controlling. Your extraneous variables are those other ones. So anything else that can influence the language that the person is using at that specific moment in that specific context is an extraneous variable, and you need to think what they are. So you can't control it, but it may affect the results of your study. So for example, I spoke last week about someone who was investigating the differences between a female and a male's closing speech. But she had the extraneous variable that they had different accents, and had grown up with different backgrounds, and she obviously had no control over that. So she identified that as an extraneous variable. Okay, so make sure you've got those down. Take some time to digest them because you will need to use those phrases. Right, demand characteristics. It's a psychology term really. So this is the idea that if people know they're being studied, they're going to adapt the language. So last year, one of the year 12s took some year 7 students out of my lesson to have a conversation with them, but they all knew that they obviously were part of some kind of investigation. Otherwise, why would they have been taken out the English lesson by a year 12 student? I think we actually told them as well. So as a result, they adapted their language and they were quite stilted. They were a bit reluctant to speak. So we didn't end up with very natural data. The data was a little bit, polluted. So it's the idea that you are demanding something of the participant to speak in a specific way, and they'll be aware of that. So that you need to limit those, and really the only way to limit them is to not do it. That kind of experiment is to not say to people, can you come in, can you send me this data, this video, this can you write me an email because I'm investigating such and such. The less they know, the better. That doesn't mean you can't involve people in the investigation. It's just try not to be too Obviously you need to be ethical, but you need to try not tell them too much about it so that they don't get an idea of, oh, I need to speak in this way. I've actually just been reading a book. It's called Humankind. And it goes through psychology experiments and how it as part of it, and the amount of times that people come out of a study and say, oh, I only did that because I thought that's what the experimenter wanted me to do. You know, their demand characteristics, and people like to please people, so if they get an idea that you want something specific from them, then that's what they'll give you, and it won't be natural. That also leads to reservist paradox. So it's this really sort of another chicken and egg situation where, you know, if you're observing language being used, it won't ever be natural, because the fact that you are there will make it invalid. It will mean that it's not a natural situation. Okay, so they're all phrases that you need to be embedding into your methodology, and you need to be trying to limit these as much as possible. Right, what do we mean then by a representative sample? So you do need to have one. Basically, it's the idea that whatever your data is, it will be able to represent a wider body of language users. So if you, another way of looking at it is your sample can represent more people than are actually in it. So if you were to investigate language in one novel, you're going to be really limited in how much you can say, oh, well, this applies to all novels. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's just that writer, or maybe it's just that book, or maybe it's just that genre. I mean, it depends, doesn't it? But if you were to study a range of extracts from young adult novels, then that's a more representative sample, because you can say, well, it's present in these three and they're all of the same genre and they've got different writers, so it's likely they'd be in a range of young adult novels. So trying to pick some data that you can reliably say could apply to a wider range of people. Now, don't get bogged down too much about this, because you can always justify it if you have a limited representative sample by the constraints of your investigation. So you can say, ideally, I would have liked to investigate a wider range of people, or people from different backgrounds, or people from different regions, people of different ages. However, given the limited scope of this study, it was infeasible to do so. And that's fine, as long as you identify that. And then the last thing to consider is that you should try and pick a sample in which language is used naturally, in a natural setting. So like we said before, that the reason being, it stops demand characteristics. If you're investigating language use between friends and you go in there with your pen and pencil and your tape recorder, well, it's not going to be very natural anymore. So therefore it won't be representative, because all you can prove is that friends, when they know they're being watched, will speak to each other in that way, not actually that they'll do it in a natural way. So there's lots of things to think about, as you can see. Oh, great phrase as well. So if you are able to select data and pick a sample in which language is used naturally, then your investigation will have high ecological validity. Can you make sure you've written that phrase down? That's what you really should be aiming for. That basically means that it reflects real life experience. Ecological validity. A low ecological validity would be one where it's a really contrived, obviously set up situation, and nobody would speak that way in real life. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to summarize everything I've said so far by giving you an example of what, decisions you can make that draw together all of those all that new terminology and new ways of kind of approaching this. So this is an investigation that somebody did last year. So you want to investigate the extent to which there's a difference in the language used between homo and heterosexual males. Okay, so let's imagine that's your starting point. So the first thing that you need to do is pin down what's your source of data, who are your participants going to be, and what constraints have you got that are going to limit your options. So if I myself go in to interview my participants, so if I happen to know 2 homosexual and 2 heterosexual males, and I go in and I interview them, and they look around the table or at the Zoom, and they realize, I think I can see what she's getting at here. then you're going to create demand characteristics and an observer's paradox, and you're not going to get anywhere. So I am going to discount that method for this study. I feel like it will just create an inauthentic collection of data that I won't really be able to use. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to rely on sources that are already available. So I'm going to use unknowing participants. So they will have no idea that I'm using the language for a study, but it doesn't matter because it's in the public domain. They've put it out there so I can use it if I want to. Now, it's actually impossible in 2,000 words to look at language across lots of different mediums, given the constraints. I've got time constraints, I've got 2,000 words constraints. I can't be looking at heterosexual and homosexual males' language in newspapers, TV shows, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on YouTube stars, but I'm going to have a reason for that. You need to have a reason for everything that you decide, and there's lots of little micro decisions that you're going to go through before you start your investigation. So you're going to justify the fact that you're focusing on YouTube stars because that's going to help you create a representative sample. The language used on YouTube is far more natural than on the news or on reality TV shows even, or especially in interviews as well. So as a result, because it is fairly natural, you could say that it's fairly representative of how language would be used in a natural setting with friends or just in everyday life. And that would therefore give your investigation high ecological validity. It's reflective of real life. Now, obviously, there's a limitation to that. People do speak a little differently on YouTube. It depends what the relationship with their fans are, what kind of persona they've created their channel about, through. And you would need to identify that and discuss that. But overall, this is a really justifiable approach. There's a lot of reasons why to look at it this way would help your data be quite natural and fair. Okay, so I'm sorry it goes back to 1. It should be number 5. So once you've decided that and you've justified that you're going to use YouTube videos, you decide that you're only going to look at 2 homosexual and 2 heterosexual YouTubers because you cannot possibly have time or word count to investigate anymore. So you also, because of these limitations, decide to only study the first minute of each clip. Please do not just select random sections of different texts. You need to be really methodical and really fair. It has to be a procedure that you follow. You need to select the same section of each piece of data that you're using. If you didn't, I would just literally have to tell you to start again. So please remember that. So your independent variable in this case is going to be the sexuality of the speakers, and then to reduce your limitations, you're going to reduce the number of extraneous variables. So to do that, you're going to make sure that all your YouTubers come from a similar region, which will then help you to extinguish the variable of accent and dialect. You're going to make sure they're all of a similar age, and you're going to make sure they're all of similar popularity. You are also going to make sure that you have videos that are of similar topics, because otherwise the lexical choices they make won't really be comparable, because they're going to obviously have to use different vocabulary for different topics. You're going to select the first minute of each one, and then you're going to ensure the clips are from a similar time period. You can't really, I know this is a very thingy example, but people's discussion of Trump from 6 years ago before he's president is very different to what it's going to be like now. So it doesn't have to be the same day or even the same week, but I think whatever the topic is, just make sure there's been no reason for the choices to change based on something contextually. And also, if it's too far apart, then you might start having to bring in cultural perceptions of sexuality and how that's changed. So try and make sure that it's at least the same year, and definitely that nothing has happened in between the 2 videos or the 4 videos that might be another extraneous variable. Now again, remember, extraneous variables are going to exist. You just need to control them as much as possible and identify the ones you can't control and take that into account when you're doing your analysis. Okay, so that's an example of everything we've talked so far in terms of how it should influence how you build up your methodology. I should have said that you don't need to write all this down, but it's too late now. You might have already done it. It might be worth noting the time when this is, just in case you want to come back to it as an example. Okay, so we're now going to look at types of data. Now, the first type of data that we're going to look at is quantitative data, which is basically numerical data, or it's a quantitative approach to your analysis. You're looking at numbers. All right, so you might, for example, compare the number of imperatives used in a transcript between men and women, obviously seeing if Leacock's right or Tannen's right in terms of male dominance and giving orders, etc. You might look at the mean length of utterance in different children of different ages, as for child language. Basically, it just has to be number-based data, and your analysis has to focus solely on the numbers. So as a result, it maybe isn't useful by itself, which I'll come to in a second. Now, really important when it comes to quantitative data, which is what we had a few issues with this year, is that numbers are not as useful as percentages. So people were making these beautiful bar graphs and pie charts of numbers of imperatives, but actually it really massively depends on how often the person spoke. So if you tell me that a boy uses far more imperatives than a girl, and then I come back and say, yeah, but the boy's spoken twice as much as the girl, then how do you know that they use more imperatives because they spoke more or because they're being dominant males? So the best way to do it is to work out the percentage of utterances that are imperatives. Now, what that would mean is you would need to count up the number of utterances made by the males compared to the females, and then you'd need to obviously divide the number of imperatives by that number and then times it by 100 to get your percentage. If you need help with this, it's probably best to just ask me on a one-to-one basis. You can send me the figures. I can even help. I can even do it for you if you want, but it's important that you do work with percentages. The same with types of words. So it's useless saying they use 5 dynamic verbs compared to 3. Well, what if the person who used 3 had only actually said 3 sentences? Then that means 100 utterances. That means 100% of their utterances had dynamic verbs in, and that's really interesting. So it's not about how many numbers, it's about what proportion of their language was used up with this linguistic feature, whatever you're looking at. So please work out percentages. It will just make your data so much richer and your pie charts and graphs so much richer as well. Now, what this will create is a positivist approach. That is where you are really objective as a researcher. You are you're not applying any expectation or knowledge of context. You are literally just looking at numbers or percentages. You are not applying anything that you know about the world. It's like you're a robot and you're just stating what's in front of you numerically, and that's all that you care about. And I'll come back to why that's not enough in a second. Okay, so just a heads up, you don't need to be counting words all the time. There's actually a lot of programs online that allow you to paste your transcripts in, and then they'll actually sort them out for you, or they'll literally say to you, there are 6 dynamic verbs in this transcript. So there's an example of one there, and I'll send you some more if I can find them. I can't think where I've saved the links from last year, but I will get them to you, and you can try Googling it yourself. Linguistic analysis or linguistic analysis generator is probably a good place to start if you want to have a look yourself. So that'll just save you time, but you can't just rely on this numerical approach. You get marked on AO1, 2 and 3, and your AO3, as always, is really important. It's about you being able to explore the meanings created in the context in which they are spoken, and if you just use that approach and say, a boy uses 20% imperatives and a girl uses 50. Leacoff was wrong, Tannen was wrong. Well, not necessarily. You also need a qualitative approach. So this is where numbers go out the window. This is not about numbers, this is about context. So this is about you actually looking back at the actual data in the context the language is spoken in and drawing conclusions based on your knowledge of the world, your knowledge of the context, what you can bring to it as a researcher. So this is far more interesting, I think. So you're not going to, and also there's not many investigations that we do within English language that you would need to just look at numbers. There's obviously some things that you need just numerical analysis on, but this is not one of them. So you don't just look at the percentage or number of imperatives used, you look at how they're used, when are they used, to what effect are they used. Now this is obviously more time consuming. You need to go back to your transcripts, you need to highlight each of the imperatives, you need to look at how they're responded to, you need to look at how effective they are, and then you need to draw your conclusions. But this is where I think it's really interesting and really exciting. Like, you get to go and devour this transcript and see what conclusions you can find. What are you, as an A-level student, finding out about language that refutes all these theories that have been around for years, or that actually supports them, surprisingly? So it's a really fun, I think, process, and you do need to do it methodically. But to me, that's such a buzz that you can get from just looking at this data and seeing what you can find. Now, what that means is that you take an interpretative approach. And again, that's a nice phrase you can put into your methodology. I should have put it in bold, sorry. So this is where you consider the context, I should say, I'm sorry. This is where you consider the context in which the language is used, and you're going to draw conclusions from that, and you're going to apply your own thoughts as a human being. So you're not a robot anymore. You're going to be an A-level student who understands context of language, who understands different layers of theorists and what our current perceptions of language are, and you're going to see if that's applicable in this transcript. So it's far more interesting, far more layered. Right, so you need both. You can't just rely on one or the other. I mean, you could just rely on qualitative, to be fair, but I do think the quantitative gives you data a little bit of more sort of scientific reliability, and it will help you get more marks. So you're going to start, I've gone the wrong way around. No, I haven't. So you're going to start quantitatively. You're going to start looking at percentages and actual figures, and then you're going to dive into the qualitative approach. You're going to evaluate your initial conclusions. Yes, it looks like the boy's using more imperatives. However, let's dive into those imperatives. Actually, this is a very weak imperative. The female ignores him. But every imperative the female uses, even though she doesn't use as many, the boy listens to her. So actually, she's more powerful in this situation. They're the kind of things that you should be concluding. Right, last thing I'm going to say for today's video, I've realised as I'm going through that I need to split this into 2 lessons. It's too much. So this is the last thing I'm going to, one of the last things, is researcher bias. Now, with both types of data, you are going to have to check. That means you're going to have to be aware and try to leave it at the door, your researcher bias. For example, if you are looking for differences in male and female's language, you may, when you're looking numerically, ignore the things that they use the same amount of, because you're only looking for differences. That is researcher bias. You're only looking for evidence that proves your question. You need to be looking for both sides, because remember, your questions are going to be to what extent when you're looking at when you're taking a quantitative approach. Now, your bias when it comes to qualitative is going to be even more widespread. I think it's easier to take a step back when it comes to numbers. Numbers don't lie, as the rubbish line goes. So an example is when I was investigating whether the explicit teaching of grammar improves students' writing for my master's, I actually moved to Malaysia in the middle of that. I'd already done I've already collected all my data, but when I came to do my analysis, I was living in Malaysia. I was living in a culture that did explicitly teach grammar. I was living in a culture that a lot of students who'd learned English as a second language had seemed to have a better grasp of grammar than the students I'd left behind. So my own perception of grammar really altered by that experience, and I had to keep on stepping back and making sure that I wasn't making my analysis and my conclusions fit what I'd learned to be true for me in the context I'd experienced. So it's about staying open-minded. Don't pigeonhole your data and make it fit what you think. You need to really be interested in what does my data show me and what can I learn from my data, not how does this data prove that I am right about the way I think about language. Now that's just a human thing to do, so don't, that's not a bad, it doesn't make you a bad person if you do it that way, but you need to be aware of this natural urge that we have as human beings, and you need to try and, like I say, leave it at the door and take a really open-minded approach. Okay, so stay objective. Right, I'm just going to finish with this example today, and then I will leave the rest till tomorrow. Okay, so let's imagine, which is what one of the students did last year, that you're going to investigate whether children as young as 5 are displaying differences in language use according to their gender. So you record a transcript of the children speaking to each other. Now, you're not just going to look for differences, like I've just said, because that's researcher bias. You're going to be looking for similarities and differences in these 5-year-olds' language usage. You're going to investigate quantitatively first. So you're going to look at numbers. And you're going to compare the percentages, I should have said, sorry, of the following in each child's speech. You're going to look at percentage of imperatives, turn taking, interruptions, questions, abstract nouns, different types of pronouns, anything at all, whatever you think is useful for your study. You're then going to draw conclusions, and you're going to say that the male is already, based on your numerical approach, based on your quantitative approach, is already displaying signs of typical language according to Lakoff, more imperatives, etc. You bring Tannen in if you want to. But then you're going to investigate qualitatively, and you're going to actually go into your transcripts and you're going to look at each of these in turn. So you can see it's quite a methodical, time-consuming process, but it's what the task demands, really. So you're going to look at each linguistic choice, for example, imperatives, and you're going to go and have a look specifically at the transcript, and you're going to realise, for example, that female imperatives are actually more impactful, and therefore the female is demonstrating more power in the conversation and is actually refuting Lakoff. Now, I hope you can see how that would work really nicely as an analysis journey, and you get really nice evaluative marks there, because by starting with the quantitative and then going into the qualitative, you're actually evaluating your own findings, and that's a way to get band 5, as we know. Now, so when you'd write it up, you would arrange your analysis under linguistic headings. So you wouldn't arrange it under similarities and differences. We'll come back to this at a later date. But you would have a subheading, use of imperatives. Then you'd have your quantitative analysis of imperatives, and then you'd have your qualitative analysis of imperatives. Then you do your same with turn taken, then you do the same with interruptions, etc. Okay? Right, I'm going to leave that there for today. There's more coming tomorrow, and then I will give you some digestion time to really think about how this shapes your own thoughts about what you want to do and what kind of data you think you'll be able to feasibly collect. Please email me if anything's unclear or you want me to go over anything again, because I'm aware that this will be quite new for a lot of you. And just keep me posted. Right, take care, guys. Bye.